a pleasure to be with you. I would actually have a gloss on what you said and reverse and say that I think the study of halakha is quite helpful in understanding the legal systems, and there's not one or two of us with good backgrounds who actually teach law. And once upon a time we were in yeshiva. Anyway, and they say you can't take you can take a boy out of yeshiva. Maybe that's. So I'm going to talk to you for a while, but I hope you'll interrupt at any point because it's your session. And I hope you'll feel free to jump in with questions or clarifications or whatever you want, because it's your session. We thought we'd talk a little bit about the global framing of where disability and legal systems fit in. And the UN convention that you have is a nice way to do it. It's something that I worked on along with a cast of thousands for about 5 years at the UN. It's been ratified, meaning the state agrees to obey its obligations by over 130-something countries, including Israel, where I arrived from yesterday morning. And seeing this is actually the largest legal reform project in the world. It's taking a group that formerly did not have technical standardized laws, and now countries are going back and thinking about what to do about this segment of the population, which is usually their largest minority group. When we were drafting the convention, the figure that they threw around was that 10% of the world's population has a disability. Now the World Bank and the World Health Organization says 15%. So from 675 million up to 1 billion, business is good. Right? And if you are a minister, whether it's public health or whether it's finance or whether it's education, and you're thinking about 15% of the population, this is something that really gets your attention, especially if that group has been under-evaluated. Usually, for example, public health ministers are thinking about things like HIV, 1.5%, diabetes in this country, like 6 or 7%, getting very dangerous in this country about that. Not that I couldn't stand to lose weight either. But when you talk about 15%, that really focuses the conversation. So why do we have this convention? What does it mean? And what's it doing? And what are some of the practical questions about it? And from the end of the Second World War, which is when the UN began, until this treaty negotiation process began in 2001, there's 7 core, meaning legally obligated, enforceable human rights treaties. And when we talk about international law and human rights, in international law is to law the way, say, the World Wrestling Federation is to wrestling. Right? So if you think about law in terms of American or Anglo-American values, that if you go to court, you get a judgment, it gets enforced, that's usually not the way it works. You get a recommendation in international law, you get a judgment, you get shaming, you have reputation, you have pressure. Most of the time it affects change, some of the time it doesn't. If we were being very philosophical about it, we would say that it's mostly driven by expressive norms. Everyone understands what the standard is, eventually countries internalize the standard, they either agree to abide by it and eventually acculturate to it, or they decide not to. But in any case, there are 7 core treaties. All of them, of course, affected people with disabilities as people, because they're human rights treaties. But none of them really specifically went to disability. The only exception is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary in November. And there, in Article 25, it says children with disabilities basically should go to school to the extent possible. A little bit of a difference, right? So when we talk about race, gender, when we talk about ethnic minorities, immigrants, etc., we don't say they should be part of society, but only to the extent possible. We say they are equal, they should be part of society. And so there was a big gap between what the UN was thinking and doing, what international governments were thinking and doing, what was happening on the ground. So circa 2000, even though they said 10% of the world's population had a disability, if you looked at the poverty line, those living below the $1 a day figure, which is modulated by country, right? So it's culturally contextual. 20% of those individuals had a disability. So quite again. The largest program that the international world was doing is called the Millennium Development Goals, which was supposed to halve world poverty by 2015. It's been a spectacular failure for many reasons. There's going to be post-2015 Millennium Development Goals or something called it like it, and there were 8 goals. And all of them really reference disability but never mention disability. So the UN is spending billions and billions of dollars and thousands and tens of thousands of person hours on poverty, but there's no indicator or target or mechanism to include people with disabilities, with twice the prevalence of living under the poverty line. They were thinking about education for all. Education for all has been a project under the UN system for years, but all the schools they were building weren't accessible. So we talked about the 70 million kids of primary school age not in school, 1/3 of them have disabilities. But the MDGs don't include disability. Maternal health, which is very important, women, which is very important, didn't talk about people with disabilities because we're both supposed to be asexual and not part of that group. Same with HIV awareness, etc. So there's a real gap. And there was a push at the international level by the government of Mexico to get a treaty on the line. This was in 2000. Previously, in 1986, 1987, the Italian government and the Swedish government went to the General Assembly and said, we need a disability treaty. And the UN said, well, we've done a lot of treaties, we're treated out, we're tired, we've got women, we've got kids, we've got migrants. We're coming up to this thing about, racial discrimination and xenophobia, and at which point we'll kind of bash Israel and do some other stuff. We're tired, we're busy, leave us alone. We've got all these other soft laws, declarations. Everyone should be nice to disabled people. They're all equal. Declarations, non-enforceable stuff. 2000, the government of Mexico really pushed it over the top by putting together a coalition and arguing in the General Assembly, much like you would argue in any parliament or Knesset or Congress, etc., that this is something that ought to be done. And anyone want to guess why Mexico? This is politics, not law. And if you follow the whole treaty, you'll see from the time that the General Assembly says, go forth and think about a disability treaty to the time that it adopts it, it's the Vicente Fox government. Politics. Fox was running for the candidacy of his party. Mexico is one of those countries at that point, if you won that particular party's nomination, you would win the presidency. The person he is running against happens to be a wheelchair user. As part of their negotiations, chair user says, I will back out and back you for the nomination if you will promise to go to the UN and move for this treaty. And Fox said, well, it sounds like a good idea anyway. Why don't we do this? And so the General Assembly says, go forward and think about having this disability rights treaty, and creates a committee to consider it. And we can talk about the UN if you like. There were 8 sessions, each of 2 weeks. Each was in New York. It was not originally a session to go and draft a treaty. It was to consider whether there should be a treaty. And the UN looked by regions. So at that time, any committee or any negotiation would be chaired by a person from within the region. In this case, came down to Latin America. And it was the turn for Ecuador, and they called up Luis Gallegos, who's a lovely man. He's now returning to Ecuador. He's been their ambassador either to Geneva or to New York or to DC for the last 15 years. And they said, would you chair this? They said, well, I'm a very small delegation, it's a lot of work. And they said, well, but we need you to do it. He said, well, who doesn't like disability? This should be easy. This should be easy. Who doesn't like disabled people? Well, okay. So the first 2 sessions had to do with, should there be a treaty, should there not be a treaty? And during the first session, the only country that resisted having a disability treaty was U.S. This was during the Bush administration, and it was not framed in terms of what some people who are moderately right to far right of center raise as, in their view, a principled obligation to sovereignty, which, by the way, is not a very strongly supportable, not really a very strongly supportable objection, because in the U.S., even if you adopt or ratify an international treaty, you still have to go to Congress and the Senate and adopt international law into domestic law so that you can go to court. So the whole sovereignty thing is actually doesn't have a lot of traction, but it's something that's very attractive to people of certain political bases. But that's not how they framed it. They said, well, it's a matter of domestic concern. Disability is not an international thing. It's a matter for domestic concern, individual countries. So let's do a survey. Let's look around the world, see what's out there, come back in another 10, 12 years, sit down again and rev up the process, and that didn't go down very well. In the next session, it was very clear that there would be a disability treaty, but the issue was, and there the US said, well, okay, but we're not gonna support it, we won't get in the way, but we also won't support it. There I found it quite puzzling. Again, this is politics rather than law, because there are things called side sessions. At the UN, you negotiate from 10 to 1 and from 3 to 6, and in between, you have sessions where you present information. Sometimes it's state delegations, countries, right? Sometimes it's long-winded academics. Last month at the UN, I chaired one for joint Israel-German mission. I also chaired one for the national human rights institutions. Sometimes it's civil society that actually do it. The US had an opportunity to say, you know what, this isn't for us, but we've had the ADA at that point for 10, 12 years. Let's teach you what we know. We think it's a really great thing. Please take it and use it. And they decided, because this was the Bush, Bolton, Cheney years, to totally disengage. I thought that was a lost opportunity, but that's me. At that point, the negotiations were, well, what kind of treaty should this be? Should it be human rights, civil and political rights, all this side of the room? Negative rights, Isaiah Berlin? Should it be thou shalt not discriminate, right? Equal formal justice, that's all this side of the room? Or should it be more development, economic, social rights, affirmative action, vocational training, standard of living, right to employment? Which one of these should it be? And they decided in the end that it should be both, and that they should act holistically in conjunction with each other. So, classic example. There is a prohibition on discrimination in employment. There is also the requirement for special measures, which they list affirmative action, but it could also, include quotas, vocational training, you include job set-asides, government procurement contracts, your government, whatever government, gives out lots of contracts. So why not choose X group rather than Y group in order to get something? So they decided to do both. And during this time, for the first time in UN history, we talk about participation and inclusion. For the first time ever, the targeted group participated as individuals and as NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Now, that's not to say that when they negotiated CEDAW, Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that there were no women in the room. That's, of course, would be wrong. But women's groups as NGOs were not participating. The same thing for migrants, the same thing for ethnic and racial discrimination, the same thing for the indigenous soft law, which is not an enforceable treaty, and that took 25 years to negotiate. This treaty took 5 years to negotiate, and I think in large part because it broke the mold on participation. So how did these disabled people get there? Well, at the first session, Ambassador Gallego said, well, we're only supposed to consider, should there be something to help this group? How can we decide unless we have the group here? So under UN rules, if you're registered under a certain standard, you can appear. At the first ad hoc session, there were 85 people registered with disabilities. At the last session, over 850. So the whole focus of the convention from the disability point of view was one of participation. And the theme, or the slogan which the groups had at that point was nothing about us without us. Don't make decisions about us unless we're involved in it. So, from the beginning, the idea of participation. The UN at that point, not particularly accessible. It's not, yes, please.
Were the people who came with disabilities to these meetings representing all the countries of the world, or just America?
Great question. Here is the reality of UN politics, and it comes down to funding. If you're going to have 2-week sessions in New York City, the groups that could afford it are either coming from developed countries or are tapping into, if they're lucky, the UN fund for participation, which, for whatever reason, over the 5 years, the country that gave the most was Lebanon. There is an imbalance in politics and in political strength between, we can use the words developed, northern, western countries, and between the developing world. And you see this, I'll jump ahead, you see this reflected in a lot of the text of the convention, which I know you've read word for word and lovingly committed to memory. When I went to yeshiva, I used to get the Parker pen, first for doing the daf, and then, first for the block, and then for the daf. So I know you've memorized the whole thing, word for word. You can see an imbalance in it. So here's some interesting ways to read the document. Things that don't quite fit in the document get taken out and get put into the preamble, which is the kitchen sink, everything that comes in front. So one example. If you are living in the developing world, and 80% of people with disabilities are in the developing world, by the way, almost 80% of all people are in the developing world, but never mind. 80% of people with disabilities in the developing world, you are most likely, if you're really, really, really lucky, independent and self-employed. If you are, and that's a very small percentage, if you are less lucky but still really fortunate, you're probably living with your families, which come with both blessings and difficulties. I could tell stories about families that, all over the world where I work, who support their households with people with disabilities. I could tell you stories about people with disabilities being locked up and never leaving their homes. But they're fed, they're well taken care of. Most of them are living at home with their families. If they're less lucky, they're living on the streets. And if they're less lucky than that, they're living in institutions, social care units, nursing homes, conditions. I visited them in about 12 countries. Conditions that vary from, this is before your time, the Romanian disabled kids, right, being put up in cages. They use cages in Czech Republic. It was actually a formal rule. You have people with disabilities, you put them in cages. Tie them down, etc. To conditions that, and I say this as a child of a Holocaust survivor, often would make the Germans somewhat proud about, starving people, leaving them in their urine, feces, sexual abuse, rape, beating, etc., and so on. So from a global perspective, families are important. If you look through the convention, you'll see that the role of families within the formal articles is highly diminished, hardly ever mentioned. There was at one point a separate article for families. In the preamble, you see a little bit about recognizing the role of families. If you are from the North developed world, I saw your hand, don't worry, you understand that rehabilitation and habilitation, your view of it is these are medical professionals who are controlling my life, telling me what to do, what I need, where I fit in. If you go work in the developing world, as I do, and you come with me, say the slums in Hanoi, or go out in rural China, and you see people like yourself who are crawling on the ground, or don't have artificial legs, or don't even have a cane, you think rehabilitation, habilitation is a pretty necessary thing. So it's very much skewed. It's going to be very much skewed by those people from privileged countries who are coming and having their perspectives. And sometimes it tends to run over some of the other perspectives. And that's a tension. And although everyone talked about nothing about us without us and trying to be inclusive, if you read the document objectively, you'll see that it's very much influenced by people who are more elite and in power than those who are in development.
How do you decide what is counted as a disability? Or how do they decide? Seems like a
Okay, there is no formal definition in the convention. If you look at Article 2 under definitions, there's no definition disability. The reason for that is if there was, we would still be there negotiating. There is, and this is a two-edged sword that the disability rights community doesn't like to talk about. On the one hand, we say there is this social model, which we'll get to in a second, which says that it's not the person with the disability, it's not an internal impairment, it's not a defect, it's rather the way we create society around people. So it's not the wheelchair use, it's why do we build a public courthouse with stairs? It gets a little harder to make that argument when you talk about everyone should speak sign language or not, or everyone should speak Braille or not, but that's the basic notion. The social model of disability is reflected in this treaty under Article 1 that's entitled Purpose. It's the only UN treaty ever that has some article that says purpose. And any future international lawyers want to guess why it says purpose? Because you're not allowed to reserve, I'll take the whole treaty except for this, or I'll take the whole treaty except for I interpret this part this way, against the purpose of a treaty. So under purpose, they say that disability is this evolving concept that has impairments related to physical, mental, sensory, that in relationship with the constructed environment impede individuals from the full fulfillment of their human rights. What does that mean? That's even more vague than, it's more social model than the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. It's also more vague than the ADA, which comes under justified criticism for being somewhat vague. At the end of the day, it means that as international instruments get transposed, brought down, and interpreted at every country level, every country has to make its own interpretation of what that group means. In some respects, it's going to push the envelope forward. So if you looked at UNDP, United Nations Development Program, self-reported, and the disability statistics, self-reported incidents of disability, you'll see Kenya and Bangladesh say 0.75% of 1%, which is demographically impossible. World Bank says more like 15 to 17% average. You know, China came up with a number, if you like, I can tell you how they did, 6.3%, which is complete rubbish. They just picked up and created the number. But be that as it may, it's going to push the numbers more in the direction of that. If you were to, by the way, sort of look at the world, you would see that the more developed a country is, the more likely, because of less stigma, they are to have people self-declaring as having disabilities. Also because, to be cynical, there are more benefits that you can tap into. So the US has a 17% rate, the United Kingdom 19%, New Zealand 22%, Canada around 20-21%, etc. How did these numbers get? Well, I go back to the double-edged sword. We talk about disability being social construct. It's something that we created, it's a label. But on the other hand, you know, when countries come back and say, well, we didn't really think about people as being disabled. We here in Rwanda, everyone is miserable. Lots of people are missing limbs. Or if we're in Sierra Leone, where people's right hands were cut off for voting, we have literally hundreds of thousands of people missing limbs. We don't think about disability as that category separate. Everyone is in bad shape. So there's this interesting tension the disability community doesn't talk about. But at the end, every country has to.
So you were describing the different developing countries and how they were different. And, it wasn't clear to me how much of this is due to lack of money, literally, and how much of it is due to bad planning and could be fixed simply by changing the law.
You mean the situation of people
Of
with
developing,
disabilities?
of how they take care of disabled people. How much of it is just they don't have enough money to take care of it, and how much of it?
Okay, resources are always an issue, and anyone who avoids speaking about resources and is all rainbows and lollipops is really skirting the issue. Resources matter at some point. Resources don't matter as much as countries that don't want to spend the resources, whether developed or developing, claim. The reason being, they're already under obligations to get all the primary age school kids into school. So example, Ghana was a huge success under Education for All. 90% of all primary school age kids in Ghana are in school. The 10% are pretty much all the disabled kids. So sometimes, you know, resources are important and resources need to be spent. Sometimes resources have been spent poorly in the past, but that doesn't undercut the factual argument that that means it takes resources to fix them. We put in STEP. Ghana's in here, Ghana, since we're in Ghana. Ghana built ramps to go over, built these bridges to go over their huge motorways. They all have stairs. They've been sued, now they have to tear it all up and put in some kind of lift or some kind of access or ramp or something so that people can go from one side of the highway to the other. So sometimes the resources are still being spent. Sometimes though, the resources are just lack of imagination. You have to do Education for All, you have to do poverty alleviation as part of all these international programs which are all funded. If you think about the disability sector as being part of the community rather than being apart from it, it's less of a resource conflict. But resources are real. And from country to country, it's going to be different. If we're going to jump to the other side of Africa, in Uganda, over, I think the last figure was 55% of their national budget comes from outside the country through donor organizations. Those donor organizations said, you have ratified this treaty, you must have everything be inclusive, then you've got a very different mode of spending than if they don't. So resources are important, but also the way you use them is important.
Yeah, I was wondering, well, amongst the people who, you said like 800 disabled people showed up, was there a bias towards a certain type of disability amongst those people? So not only like what country they were from, but also whether it was more like, say, like physical disabilities and mental disabilities or something like that. And if so, does that play out in the convention?
Okay, great question. Obviously, the wheelchair users are the smartest and the best looking, but putting that to the side. It's not so much a bias towards particular groups, but rather a sensitivity, or even at times a lack of sensitivity for what groups are not. People with, the UN was not particularly accessible at that time. It's governed by international law, not by US law or New York City law. It's being renovated now, and they're doing a fantastic job, and the parentheses story about that is Ban Ki-moon came to International Disability Day, December 3rd, and expressed shame, which in the Asian context is a very deeply meaningful context, and promised that they would make it accessible. At the time, it wasn't. So, the wheelchair users, those of us, sat in the back of the room in one corner. The deaf people sat, on this side of the room and shared interpreters. The blind people, and by the way, 90% of people who are called blind are not blind as in can't see anything, but rather blind as in low vision, narrow vision, highlighted vision, light differential, etc. Bless you. They didn't receive alternative texts, right, larger print, etc. So
Sorry,
there
so
was.
they did or they did not?
They did not. They did not from the UN. There were various organizations, including for 2 sessions, the World Union of Progressive Judaism. Why? Because someone who happened to do disability work was there, and the organization said, we'll do it. So it wasn't so much that, but there was a sensitivity to at least include people with what are called psychosocial disabilities. They used to be called mental disabilities or mental health issues. And people with intellectual disabilities that in the old days they used to use the R word, which my friends in that group really detest, so I at least will not use it. Within the disability world, there's always a lack of voice, sufficient lack of voice for those with the intellectual, cognitive, mental disability. There was also a group of indigenous people with disabilities who came from Canada for the first 3 sessions. And Canada is a developed, and reasonably wealthy nation. It produces obviously the nicest people. But they ran out of money after 3 sessions. So at one point there was an article drafted for indigenous people. Now you see it again in the preamble, which is the kitchen sink. You see indigenous. But if you look at the convention, if you look at the treaty text, look at education, where we talk about modalities of education. So we're talking about Braille, we're talking about sign language, right? We're talking about tactile for those who are blind deaf, right? But there's nothing there about indigenous language, and that was an opportunity that was lost. When we talk about property and the rights of ownership, the whole idea of indigenous notions of property aren't even raised. When we talk about participation in culture, sports, and life of the community under Article 30, there's nothing there about indigenous as well. So sometimes these groups fall through the cracks and get lost. There is nothing in the convention or in any international human rights instrument about gays, lesbians, sexual minorities. Some of the language that talked about respect for the family, respect for sexual and reproductive health within the health sphere was challenged, pushed, peered down by various delegations, including the U.S., the Arab League. That was the U.S., the Arab League, the Vatican, and within the Arab League, particularly the representative from Syria, who was young, loud, obnoxious, and quite offensive. To be fair, though, within the Arab League, the woman from Jordan was absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. Please.
When you were discussing the different advantages of, people self-employed living with family, then you had number 3 on the streets and number 4 in nursing homes. I'm wondering why you have the people on streets more advantageous than people who are in nursing homes and institutions who are at least getting food and sometimes good care?
That's a great question, and in some places, your point is well taken, in some places it might be to an advantage to be in a proper structured place. The experience, I've inspected them in 12 of these developing countries, and in none of them have the situations ever been that good. From a disability rights perspective, most of the time people who are placed into these institutions can't leave. So whether you're in Slovakia or Vietnam, or I could jump around the world, or Guatemala, once you are entered into them, you may be fed or you may not be fed. You might receive care, you might not receive care. The incidence of rape, sexual violence, forced abortion, prostituting out women with disabilities to prisons, I can go on, is the norm rather than the exception. Even in the ones that are considered humane, like in Korea, in Korea they're well fed and well medicated and well dressed, and the institutions are clean, very clean, and people are not beaten and people are not tied down. On the other hand, when I went there with the chair of the Human Rights Commission, the people just wanted to touch us. They wanted to shake hands, they wanted to hug, they wanted to get down to a level like this and look me or he in the eye, because they didn't have human contact. Many of my friends in developing countries prefer living on the street and having their independence and not having the support rather than being restricted from movement. But there is a good tension that you raise, and it's a tension that people haven't quite figured out. So, for example, in Burundi, there was a terrible home for war veterans with disabilities, but they pretty much took hostages and refused to be moved out because they didn't know what life would be like beyond that institution. In places with limited resources, you see, alternative sorts of things. In South Africa, there's a group home run by Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher is one person. And she gets the house rental, it's 50 rooms, from the local Catholic church, and everybody gives her their monthly benefits. And they get a room and they get food, and most of the food is donated by the Lions Club and by other organizations. So there are non-state things too, but generally when there's state institutions and care units, that's where you see the abuses, and most of the people that I know prefer to take their chances on the street. Having said that, there have to be, good examples in places, and there have to be good practices, even in developing countries. I haven't seen any of them.
I was curious just about the sort of the kinds of discussions that go on when this is considered, a discourse about human rights. Is there like a bottom line that's agreed upon between, let's say within the sort of community where there's like a discussion about what kinds of rights should be granted? Is there a bottom line assumption that these are natural rights, these are human rights, or is there, you said before, is the social construction aspect really highlighted? I'm just curious, how did that discussion take place, and how was it determined, what the bottom line for minimal rights would be?
That's great. Within every field, and generally, the articles overlap, and they're all interrelated. We say in international law, all human rights are interrelated, interdependent, right, interconnected. So if you can't get yourself on public transport, the right to vote doesn't do you much good if you can't show up at the polling booth, right? Or if you're blind and nobody will give you a tactile ballot or read to you. Within each one of those articles, there was negotiations between all the states of the world, and the disability groups got to intervene at the end, and that's why when we talk, looping back about participation, first time that the group participated, and not only that meant being present, but also speaking from the floor. And when they spoke from the floor, they talked about their lives, and they talked about what positions they had, and at the end of the document reflects compromises and positions about what the standards are. However, Standards are intentionally vague or loose because they will be transposed down to individual country levels. And there are lots of open questions. So here's a question. How do you draw the line between independent living, the right to live with others or to make your own decisions within the community, and that's an economic, social, positive right, and between the right not to be discriminated against and removed from the community and put into one of these institutions? Where does the line get drawn? Nobody knows. It's actually a matter of politics. I've had discussions with ministers. That's how much can you afford? How much are you willing to do? How do you draw the line philosophically between supported decision-making and between substituted decision-making? The disability rights community takes a fundamentalist view, one that I think is incorrect either legally, philosophically, or practically, that nobody ever can have their decisions substituted for. Everyone is facilitated. Really? Person in the coma is going to decide which house to live in? Person with the 15 IQ is going to decide who to vote for? Really? But nevertheless, you have a line between substitution and facilitation. How do you draw that line? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. So the standards are there, but how they get thought through on an individual level or on a schematic level and on facilitating decision making, nobody has that answer, and there's a lot of grappling on it. That all remains to be hashed out.
Is there a reason there was a lot of resistance to the sexual health issue because countries don't want people with disabilities to like reproduce? Like they don't want to have more people with disabilities on their hands, or is it other reasons?
Well, on some level, the old stuff about karma has morphed into genetics. So, in China for many years they talked about bad karma if you had someone with a disability in the family, and they wouldn't want you to marry into the family. Not that we see that in the Haredi community. But now they talk about in terms of bad genetics, and therefore come up with the same rationale. But by and large, the rhetoric, at least that was raised, was not one that would fit with eugenics or that kind of idea about propagating, broken and impaired, defective individuals. Which, by the way, if you go read the Nuremberg transcripts, you'll see the Nazis give lots and lots of credit to the Americans for creating eugenics and point to it as their example, which does not in any way take them off the hook or reduce, what they did or the level or the manner in which they did it. But they clearly did learn it from things in this country. But most of the rhetoric that was framed around sexual and reproductive health had to do with two fronts. One was the Vatican, the representative from Syria, and the only NGO that the U.S. government sponsored, which was the Southern Baptist National Right to Life Coalition, who are not my favorites, but I give them credit for showing up, and I give them credit for being helpful on articles that related to quality of life, where there is some common value. But they would get together and they talked about it being a conduit to abortion, which is not a right that is recognized in the international system, but because of their particular concerns, including our White House, because Karl Rove was pitching in on this through the Southern Baptists. Here's a good story. They had a cell phone, and it would ring, and that would be Karl Rove. Anytime they would cycle around the articles back to health, he knew when they were discussing it, and the phone would ring. Do you know what the phone rang? Do you know what tune it played? So you're sitting at the UN, right? You're in this huge room, and you're in the back of the room because the guy's a wheelchair user. I'm sitting next to him. Phone rings, and it plays "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." And that's Karl Rove calling from the White House. Their concern was abortion, which they raised a bunch of times. There are members within, our community who have concerns about abortion also, from religious, halachic, ethically based concerns. There were also, although why they interpreted that treaty and the language of it to relate to abortion, I'm not sure. They also related things like gender. The word gender appeared in early drafts, and they said, well, gender is a continuum, this could include homosexuality, so we need to use the word sex, which is binary, boy or girl. actually, they were really bad international lawyers. Anything to do with gay rights or sexual minority rights in the UN system arises from one particular case, which uses the word sex to interpret it. So actually, they got exactly the opposite of what they wanted. The other objection to it was one that was raised as cultural. So the state started bringing disabled people with them. Some of them were not disability rights experts, some of them were disability service provision experts, but they had disabilities, so it was very interesting to see them sitting at the tables. That was something different. Yemen was a classic example. They brought a blonde fellow who got up on this particular provision and said that in his culture that was a very offensive idea. You know, that people with disabilities should, marry, engage in sexual activities, etc. My understanding from working in much of the Islamic world and having friends who study it is a very different perspective, including having worked last week with many Palestinians, and the week before that with Iranians. But that was his objection. It's not for me to say what they believe or don't believe in. Incidentally, Yemen's census, do you know what their census question is? Do you, may Allah forbid, or anyone in your family, Allah forfend, have a disability? So how do you think they answer with that?
So I happens, the reason I'm laughing is that the last thing we did before you came was discuss the use of Rahman al-Islam in Shuvot about disability and how that changes the conversation. So if you wanted to talk about that briefly, I had another question, but that would be great if you talk about how do you think that kind of language affects the conversation?
Well, if I was taking a disability rights perspective, I would say that the history of medicalization, charity, giving, is one which is demeaning and not helpful. If I was taking, if it was me taking a more pragmatic position, I would say that there's been a lot of good things that have happened over the years, moved by charity or even just chesed generally, and we ought not to discount that. Things get framed in terms of different language at different times, and to me, it really, at the end of the day, matters as to what you're doing rather than how you're calling it. But the framing and the labeling seems to matter a lot to many people within this community.
So I'll go back, there are two poles that sort of test the boundaries of the social construction, which I think is a fascinating viewpoint, that disability is created as opposed to, so one is abortion, which so it's a really interesting challenge. So I myself have dealt with several questions, and any halachist has to deal with in the abstract, of whether the realization that a fetus will turn into a severely disabled child as grounds for abortion or not. And generally the progressive positions halachically are seen as those which permit abortion in those cases, and the fundamentalist positions or the conservative positions are those which don't. So this seems like a fascinating way of reversing that. And so I'm wondering, and so I dealt with, let's say extreme case, I dealt with a case of trisomy 13, right? But Tay-Sachs is the phenomenon, and you could push it back also, right? Because you could take a real right to life position and say that, that the notion of allowing, in the same way that there's a whole pushback against gender selection, right? So there should be pushbacks against programs that test to avoid the production of people, all right, the birth of children, right, with Tay-Sachs and things like that. So I'm wondering how at that end. At the other end, a couple of years ago in this program, we dealt with the question of whether you could impose cochlear implants on children, and part of that was the deaf community's conception of itself as a separate culture, as opposed to as disabled people. And so at the other end, I'm wondering how that, right, so we talked so far about how you accommodate, right, existing disability. How does that play out into the option of removing, socially created or not, right, removing disability as opposed to accommodating?
Okay, to unpack that. So, to begin with, the social construction argument, which is usually presented in its strongest flavor, is often interesting because, along with the social construction argument, is a not mutually exclusive, but sometimes obstructionary argument about human variation. Right, so people are different, people come in different abilities, sizes, shapes, forms, whatever. But it's purely the way that we do society. But so it's an interesting dynamic, and the community hasn't quite figured it out. For myself personally, I'm one of those liberals with a libertarian bent in that, for me it's all about personal choice, and I don't go there. But for the disability community that's thought about it and written about it philosophically, there's a real tension between, on the one hand, saying we, and in this case women, are autonomous and can and should do with our bodies as we please, and really believing that. But on the other hand, saying that, wait a minute, it's illegitimate to abort or to cease on the basis of disability. And then they make all those arguments in parallel to gender, race. Nobody really talks about poverty as a disadvantage. I mean, if you really wanted to be provocative, you would raise poverty both in the case of child bearing and child rearing. Is a child abuse to be raised within certain circumstances? But I'm not making that argument, I'm just raising it as a logical conclusion that's often not engaged. There's a weird tension there, right? Between on the one hand saying, we can do as we please with our bodies, but on the other hand, there's legitimate and illegitimate reasons, and we're going to place disability as an illegitimate reason for abortion. Within the U.S., it's created alliances from the usually left to far left disability rights community and some of the right to life folks who are rather conservative. It's an interesting politics, and the same thing plays out with end of life choices. Most of the rhetoric falls on the illegitimacy of aborting on the basis of disability, and therefore a lot of advocacy gets placed in opposition to things like national schemes of health that automatically screen prenatally, which is a good idea for public health reasons, but then identify things like Down syndrome because the incidence of elective abortion is enormously high following it. And in New Zealand, for example, the rhetoric has actually used terms like genocide.
So, I guess I'd be interested in what do you think, and in general, let's say in a convention like this, right, so do you think that the trend is towards I guess, is it logically consistent? So there's the libertarian argument, which is about rights, and then there's a moral argument, right? So even people who think that women fundamentally, you can't interfere with women's rights, do they think that it's morally wrong for someone to choose to abort because they find they're not willing to deal with the challenge of raising somebody with, for myself, Down syndrome is sort of the polls were Down syndrome and Tay-Sachs. So halachically, one of the formative things in my own thinking as formative cases that my teachers taught me was Tay-Sachs, in which it was clear that the progressive halachas were the ones who encouraged genetic testing, who permitted abortion at later stages, and a personal shock when I realized that Tzitz Eliezer, who is the great permission in Tay-Sachs, extends the logic to Down syndrome.
Well, most of them feel that it's a moral imperative against permitting abortion, and then there's also the religious aspect. There are some people who truly believe that there is a neshama there, and that it's incorrect. There's also sort of a counter theme which arises as well within the cochlear implant area, which brings us back to issues of resources as well. If you elect to remain deaf and therefore have higher costs because you need interpretation, if you elect to bring to term a child with a disability as opposed to not, there's some who have pushed back, not within the disability community, but within ministries and others, etc., even philosophers, who talk about it as an elective choice, and that therefore parents should bear the cost of it. But one point about the treaty is that one of the underlying themes is about participation, and that's one thing to bring us back to center. Here in this country, there was a marvelous, he was a lawyer technically, but he couldn't teach in law school at Berkeley, as many of us can't. But he wound up being in the rhetoric department. His name was Jacobus Tenbroek. He founded the National Federation of the Blind, the International Federation of the Blind. He wrote some of the best constitutional law pieces. They're still cited 40, 50, 60 years later. But he talked about the right to live in the world. And that, I think, is really what this treaty is about. In all aspects of life, whether it's employment, education, standard of living, clean water, etc. It's all about people with disabilities being able to do what everybody else does on a daily basis. And that's, I think, really what, if you were to take away anything from this treaty, it talks about autonomy and dignity and respect. I think it also is about the right to live in the world, the right to participate like everybody else. That's its goal, if you would put it into one sentence or less. What are countries doing about it? This is an interesting thing. How does law affect it? Well, it's the largest law reform activity in the world, because until this convention, there were maybe 25 countries that had a national disability law, as opposed to, say, social welfare benefits, healthcare, little disparate laws. Most of them were fairly bad. They were retrogressive. And now you're seeing countries, and I've probably helped write or worked on about 10 or 12 of these. Countries ranging from Vietnam, which never had one, to Bangladesh, which never had one. We're actually writing disability laws, and they're trying to interpret it, sometimes in good faith, sometimes in less than good faith, within national context. At the end of the day, though, a lot of this has to do with what the will of the state is as far as thinking about this group participating on an equal basis with others. So Israel, for many, many years, had a gorgeous law on disability. I mean, they passed a beautiful disability law. It's, lovely. You could read it. It's alliteration even in Hebrew. It's just amazing. But they never passed the regulations to implement it. So for many years, Israel was going along and becoming an OECD country, and this was one of the sectors where we talk about social inequality within there, where they just weren't doing very much. They were building public buildings, courthouses, disability service centers with stairs in them. Literally. When I was 15, the Disability Service Center in Tel Aviv was on the 4th floor, and there was no elevator. You used to ring the bell, and you'd say, well, I can't come up. They'd say, okay, take off any of it, coming down, I'll be there in a minute. Now they've ratified the convention after having been rather active at the UN. Israel was especially active on independent living and on wanting to keep sheltered workshops. So a lot of the prohibitions against abuse and exploitation in the article on work come from Israel and the International Labor Organization, because they were anticipating these sheltered, separate workshops. Interesting. So now that they've ratified it, they're spending a lot of time trying to figure out what exactly they need or don't need to do as far as implementing it. They have a Nitzivut, which is a disability commission. It's housed within the Ministry of Justice, which is not quite kosher under the convention. It's supposed to be an independent. That means that it's not under the government. The government can't cut out its funding or fire people or dictate policies. Not that the government has done that, but it's supposed to be independent. we're spending a lot of time figuring it out. So at the end of the day, a lot of it has to do with implementation. Here in this country, under our national disability law, the ADA, we've done an exceptionally good job on access. People being able to go into stores, museums, movie theaters, not yeshivot, because religious institutions, unless there is a public area that's leased out, like if let's say you lease your hall out for dances or whatever, religious institutions are exempt. But we've done a great job on that. We've done a miserable job on employment. The employment rate's been going down since 1984, 6 years before the ADA. It was at 66% before the ADA. It's hovering close to 80% now, post-economic downturn. So at the end of the day, it's really also about what governments really believe their role should be and what the role of people with disabilities should be as far as living within the community, as to what they enforce or don't enforce. So just to cherry pick examples, Finland, which has not ratified this convention as we have not, but is considered one of the model Northern European, social justice and